Hello everyone, my name's Simon Meacher from Engaging Data, and in today's Engaging Data Bites, I'm joined by Simon Spring, and we're here to talk about WhereScape and CI/CD. Thank you very much, Simon, for coming along and helping us out with this discussion about CI/CD.
You're welcome, Simon.
In your experience, why do people use CI/CD within a data warehouse environment?
I think it's about predictability and standards and being able to ensure that whole end-to-end process, whatever it looks like and however far it reaches into downstream processes, is just following a expected format. So you can guarantee that if this step completes, then the next one will continue and so on. And you've also got some kind of rollback capability as and when required. And
do people start off using CI/CD? Is it the first thing on the top of their mind, or is it something that they kind of start thinking about when things go wrong manually?
Well, I think you have different sort of appetite levels for CI/CD. My experience is that people start off, and I buy into this, manually define what you're trying to do first, and then start doing the automation. So, and when I say manually, I mean manually in terms of the different steps. Each of those steps will have a degree of automation in them anyway, depending on what you're doing. But once you've then worked out, this is the sequence we're going to, whatever it might be, discover some source system, generate a landing zone for it, generate all the code for it, and then deploy that into environment, and then run some kind of test routines, do each of those individually, and then script them out so that they can be repeated on a predictable basis.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I think you're exactly right. I think every organisation I've ever worked for has done things slightly differently as well. So if you try and charge in and try and automate that without truly experiencing what the demands of the business are, how quickly you need to go, how much rigor there needs to be behind it. I've worked for companies that have gone, you set your own standards, go. And then I've worked for big corporate blue chip companies that said, this is our standards, fit them to your process, go. And that can give you very different data development life cycles. Some have very quick, short, snappy deployments, and others are quite long-winded. There's forms to be filled out, there's evidence to be collected, and that can make a deployment quite slow. In fact, some of the bigger data warehouse projects I've worked on, they've had deployment processes that take 3 weeks to kind of go through all this checks and balances, and then a week to do the deployment, which is just painful, right? And I think depending on the way that you want to approach your deployments, the way you want to approach your development, if you're waterfall, that might be brilliant, work into a sort of month turnaround, monthly deployments, but you kind of leave no time to do any of the development work because you spend all your time getting ready for a deployment. In other places, you want a really short, sharp, snappy deployment, happens in 5 minutes because your deployments are small, they're not that complex, and they're easy to push through. And if you don't live that, you don't really know what might go wrong. And I think it's the unknown unknowns we spend most of our time fixing. And CI/CD, in my opinion, can help you build tests, build deployments that help you manage that unknown. When that unknown crops up and you go, wow, brand new scenario, I need to make sure I never fall into that trap again. Well, build it into your CI/CD and you won't, because it's there for next time. You have to think about it so much, And
having some sort of lightweight CI/CD process from the beginning, I think there's a lot of value in that. But then not spending so much time up front developing that process that it's actually slowing down the business value in what you're trying to deliver. Your business users, or whoever it is that's actually going to be consuming in the context of data and analytics, whoever's going to be consuming your outputs, your data products, your tables, whatever the outputs might be, your reports, maybe some machine learning AI stuff downstream, they don't necessarily care or have any interest in a CI/CD process. They just want to get hold of whatever their outputs are. So
Absolutely.
the sooner you get them something and then retrofit in some processes as you go along, I think the better.
I think that's one of the key points, is managing the business expectation, right? If you've got another team using your data products, they want it done, and they want it done to a date so they can do their bit, and they can, whether it's consuming the data, using it again for data science, or building it into a dashboard, whatever it might be, they just want it done, and they want a date that they can reliably use it from. And manual processes can build in risk that you don't get it done for a particular time. If you build that automated process, you take that time back, and then you create a more stable and more predictable service, because that's what it is a service, right? And then, if you've got that automation and you can rely on that rigor, and you're happy with the rollback process, so if it all goes wrong, it sorts itself out, that's a much better service than, I can tell you, I can count, all these grey hairs are from those Friday nights when we've done the deployment and it went wrong. That final step when it's going into production, and then you realise you've got a 3-hour process to back everything out, and then gone midnight, where it's Saturday morning now, and you think, I've just wasted a lot of my time and gone grayer. That's the sort of the human element of CI/CD, I suppose, from a data team point of view. It sort of leads me on to the kind of next question. When do you think you should use CI/CD? We've covered a bit of that in the last question, but when would you say are key points, trigger points, I suppose, in a data development lifecycle, a data team, when you should say, look, maybe it's time to think about CI/CD?
So I think there's the most obvious one is deploying from the process of getting what you've built in some kind of sandbox development environment into a production environment, or possibly into a test environment, but it's that process there. And so you can make sure that certain gates are automatically approved and checked, and have you followed certain standards, for instance. You can apply any kind of standardization needed for that new environment. So, for instance, all of your, within a dev environment, you're pointing your source connections to a certain database, and in production it's coming from a production database or data storage, cloud storage, or whatever it might be. So that kind of parameterization makes a lot of sense. And then I think also there's the aspect there of the actual environment and configuring that environment, and that's probably a separate piece, really, is what if that environment doesn't even exist and you're trying to spin up a completely fresh environment? Perhaps that's actually has more value on the development side than on as in the dev to dev deployment, rather than the dev to prod deployments.
Yeah.
Sort of jumping around a bit there, but.
Well, no, it makes sense. That's 10 years ago, when all the cloud-based, I'll click a button to spin up an environment, got everyone thinking about, okay, can I have a UAT environment that I can deploy into, test, and then shut down? Ephemeral systems, and I think there are options within CI/CD to do that. That reduces costs, which is a great thing. So maybe cost is something up there for people to be thinking about. If it's really expensive to run all of your environments, maybe CI/CD can help reduce costs, so you're only using virtual machines or services for a small amount of time. Obviously there are issues with data quantity, and there's lots more, so many more variables in it that you need to be thinking about, but cost is often a driver, because that's what the business are paying for. So the cheaper you can make it, the happier everyone is often. What about teams? What about different site of growth in data teams, or I mean, the one I was talking to somebody about last week was teams across the world, right? So follow the sun services, and I haven't said follow the sun for ages, but it's a team in Europe, then there's a team in Asia, and they take over from each other at a certain point in the day.
Yeah, I guess it depends on to a certain extent, your infrastructure setup, and whether or not those teams are working off the same kit or if they're working in their own individual environments. If everyone is working in their own workspace locally and then deploying up into some kind of central repository, it's slightly different to if you're working if everyone's connected into a centralized repository, for example, using WhereScape Red, and everyone's, or certainly multiple teams working off that same repository, then you don't have the same need necessarily to move code developed by Team A into the repository of Team B because they're working in the same place. But I can certainly see the benefits of being able to move code around across different regions, and maybe it's not just for follow the sun, maybe it's for some kind of failover capabilities or data sovereignty reasons, where this data worked on by this team can't leave the Singapore data center, for instance, and we need to move some other data across into the European one for when the Europe team start working. What do you think on that side of things?
There's so many different, like scale is another one, that when your team grows all of a sudden. You've got a great point, and it's my brain's going through. I can remember back in the GDPR days where, all the companies that were using India then all of a sudden couldn't, and it's like, well, how do you get that code base to the developers that can access the data and test the data model and do all that other good stuff? Back in those days, CI/CD would have been great because it's there. It's more a case of granting people permissions to the repositories to be able to then see the code and make the changes. I guess behind the question, I was starting to think about scale, because with the onset of data science, which everyone's got their own views about data science, but ultimately it's more people using the same data, which is a good thing for businesses. That creates more demand. So I'm speaking to a lot of companies that are scaling out, building out another data team in a different location. So you might need to be able to hook people into the same processes to develop on the same tool set. And often there might be it depends on your kit. Not everyone's on the cloud, right? Not everyone's able to store everything into the cloud and distribute it and collaborate on it freely. Sometimes you're on premise, and then you've got network latency, and you've got other things where sharing code becomes more complicated. And actually things like CI/CD, Git, repositories can take away some of those redundancy problems, because you just get the code down to where the developers are, and then they can carry on doing what they need to do, and they're just committing it back, and away you go. So that's a really good thing. And then ultimately, if you build Git repository CI/CD pipelines, then you can scale up and you can scale back. All you need to do is put the developer in the seat, give them the tools, tell them the process, and then you're away. You haven't like back in the good old days where everyone had their own laptop, everyone configured their laptop to use the software they wanted to use, to save files wherever they wanted to do. You had a bit more of a Wild West situation where, and I did it myself, like you go and save a copy of the code slightly differently to where the rest of the team have done it, and then you go on holiday for a week. I love
the way that's the good old days for you, not the bad old days.
Well, yeah, okay. maybe there's a few people watching this thinking, no, Simon, that was the bad old days. You really ruined your holiday for me. But no, scale. CI/CD can often help teams that are scaling up, scaling back. And And I'm sure there are other people out there they're lucky enough to work in companies that use third parties for additional resourcing for projects. And, having CI/CD makes it a bit easier to integrate a team for a short period of time and then drop them off when they're done. You also get all that audit, who did what, when.
Yeah.
I think
and
that's becoming
also gives you that, sorry to cut you off, which also gives you that rollback capability when you realize something hasn't quite worked out, and it's because maybe it's some kind of conflict, someone trod on someone else's toes, but not to the extent where it flagged anything up, but there were commits very close to each other and a lack of communication, and it can actually help with the rollbacks, but also highlight where perhaps a bit more rigor is needed in the actual process.
Yeah. Just sort of to expand on that a little bit. So how do you see CI/CD working with something like a data mesh, like the data products that people are working on now?
I think with data mesh, data mesh, let's face it, data mesh is a new name for ways of working that people have been doing for a long time. It's just pulling together certain components and giving it a new name. Having dispersed teams working on isolated deliverables is absolutely ripe for CI/CD for a lot of the reasons we've already said, for being able to pull down so I'm going to start working on this particular data product here. I need to source data. I need to know where I'm going to be pulling in data from. Let me go and find out what my sources are. They've already been created. I can utilize this. So brilliant. I'll pull that across into my new development environment. I'll spin up a new development environment. I'll start working on that, to then be able to say, okay, right now I've got that to a point where I think it's ready, and I've been working in isolation, and to be able to actually then promote that up into the next environment where it can start going through some kind of testing and other perhaps broader metadata that is part of the deliverable. So not just code, not just ultimately, let's just call it a table with some data in it, but also all of the nice catalog information that describes what it is I've delivered, that describes who has access to it, that describes how long it lasts for. Is it going to be burnt down after a month because it's for a specific project? All of that kind of information can then be pulled together and pushed across as part of that deployment.
Okay.
Do you have any? Do you see any different way that CI/CD is being used within data mesh type models?
I think the agile approach is the only way I've seen it being used. So rather than a traditional waterfall project to build stuff, but don't get me wrong, often the waterfall project initiates the whole data meshing product. But then after that, it's a very much more agile, small changes being pushed through quite regularly. And I think that's a good thing, because that was always the way, from my first sort of project in data warehousing, which was entirely waterfall driven. And then I did training courses that said agile's the way to do it. Small incremental changes. Love all of that because it simplifies my job. It means that the changes I make are easier to make, easier to test, easier to test in the production environment because I'm doing small measurable changes. That's ideal. That's ideal for any team. Nobody wants to try and eat the elephant in one go, and certainly the agile approach seems to make it a bit easier. But I also think that data mesh then helps you to the old problems that we had with you have a data warehouse, but you've got HR data as well as your business data in one data warehouse. How do you separate them? Well, data mesh answers that, because you're dealing with a product and you'll have a Git repository for your HR data, a Git repository for your business data. and it may all go into the data warehouse, which is under its own controls. But then all the Git repositories that you've set up below that feed into the central data warehouse can be can be permissioned a lot simpler. And they, it takes one more thing off of the table, stuff you have to worry about. Nobody wants to write forms and fill out documents because there's been a data breach. Somebody accidentally got access to the entire data warehouse and all of the HR data. That's not what we're here for. But so it can simplify from that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So data mesh obviously helps to do the product or break down the CI/CD to a product. How do you see WhereScape 3D and the data models in WhereScape 3D working inside of CI/CD, inside of a data mesh environment?
So I think with data products and data mesh, there's a very, very compelling reason to follow some kind of logical modeling approach or conceptual modeling approach to designing out what those products look like. You don't need to. You could be doing it purely from a physical perspective, but regardless, either way, if you're using WhereScape 3D, for instance, to design out what those logical or conceptual models look like, my product is it's to do with sales by customer or whatever it is. Here are the different concepts. These are how they map onto different source systems. That design is pure metadata, but it can, with the right rules and knowledge and sort of parameterization of target system, can then be used to generate out all of the necessary code on that target platform. So you can have your designers working at the early stage, modeling out the concept for that data product, and then that can then be pushed using CI/CD out into those different environments, and those different environments could be on completely different platforms.
Yeah.
See, I think what I've been trying to weave in is there's development. That people think CI/CD, they think spinning up tin, they think deploying code. I think there's a whole modeling element to it as well, and models as code, deploying models. I kind of made that up as it came out of my mouth, but maybe that is something. Anyway, how you work, how you have multiple teams working on the same model, and you deploy those across as logical models that could actually be at the point of deployment, then being pushed onto multiple physical platforms. You could have, and it almost weaves into the discussion, that round the clock, follow the sun discussion, which is one team might be working on a local SQL server, another team might be working on Snowflake, and another one might be using something else, Exasol, DB2. And the modeler doesn't really care what they're working on. The modeler is designing out the logical model and perhaps generating some kind of raw vault model, or whatever it might be, third normal form, star schemas, and so on. And at the point of deployment through that CI/CD process, if you've got the right tooling under the covers, like using WhereScape, for instance, part of that deployment configuration will be, by the way, this model is going on to SQL Server, so use the SQL Server templates, generate native SQL Server code. This one's going on to the Exasol in Germany. Let's generate all the native code on there, and it will look slightly different, and perhaps even the flow looks different as well. Maybe there's some slightly different steps. Maybe you don't have a landing zone because you refer directly to the original source via kind of external tables or whatever it might be. So that kind of model design automation and implementation element to CI/CD is quite different to the code generation element or code deployment element.
Okay, so we've covered a lot about the sort of theoretical why you do it, when you do it, what kind of scenarios you might want to pick up. But what's your opinion on the kind of tooling that people use? Do you think they should go out and homebrew, or do you think they should go and buy off the shelf?
I mean, I think different people have different appetites for homebrew or off the shelf. And I mean, I've certainly brewed my own beer and it tasted disgusting, but there's something quite satisfying about it. And these days, and that was a long time ago, and these days you can make some pretty, well, excellent homebrew yourself, but it takes time, of course. And do you want to be forever brewing your own and maintaining that, or do you actually want to pick something up off the shelf and shortcutting some of that? And I think it's down to the personalities and the skills involved in that team. You can buy in someone else to come and do the homebrew for you. I guess that's a bit of a hybrid. And also it depends on what tools you've got under the covers as well. If you've got WhereScape involved, for instance, then WhereScape's going to be looking after a lot of stuff like figuring out what the deltas are. If you've changed something in a table, WhereScape will generate the necessary alter statements to bring that table in line with your design. Whereas if you're not using that, then you'll need to build that into your workflow. So it depends. How great an answer is that? It depends on what tools you've got available to you. That's from a code generation or code creation perspective. Then there's other tooling like test tooling, which is so kind of comes into its own with CI/CD, being able to start building up these whole suites of different test scenarios, which I know you do a lot of work with, Simon.
Yeah, so we've partnered up with Big Eval. That it's a tool that you can go and buy. You can build everything into a central tool, integrate it with Git in your CI/CD pipelines, and that's great because it helps you build and catalog everything you need to do and integrate it to be fired off at the time that you want to do it. And that's great because most people don't want, like you say, they don't want to, that code's changed or the syntax of that language is changed this month, so I need to go back and fix all those if statements that they now require brackets or whatever it might be. But then at the same time, that they cost money, but it's effort versus reward, and smaller end teams may not have that. And going back to your point about the capability in your team, we can't. I mean, if we had a data team that had a Python developer, some sort of script developer, and they're part of a team that also do data modeling, data science, and data engineering, then we wouldn't need anything because we just have all the resources and capabilities. We could homebrew the entire lot, but quite frankly, we haven't. We've got specialists, people who are better at engineering, people who are better at modeling, people who are better at visualization. So I think that comes into play. But also going back to the top of the questions about how do you build this thing out? Quite often we would say, get your Excel spreadsheet, start writing it down, and that would be your list until you need a tool to replace that Excel spreadsheet, because that's the way it classically goes. You might be better off building some form of CI/CD yourself and around your manual processes to kind of reduce the time it takes to do the deployments until you get to a point where you go, well, do you know what? This is just clarified that we need something because our homebrew script has got us so far, but actually we now need to make it a bit more stable. Let's get a tool in that helps us do that. And like to your point, what I like about the WhereScape tools, WhereScape 3D and Red, a lot of the doing parts of the deployment of the code generation it's inside WhereScape. So it's a WhereScape responsibility to ensure the tool works. And as a developer, someone building the data models and doing the engineering, I haven't got to worry about that. I've just got to worry about, is my code right? Are my jobs going to run? Does my data model produce the right data vault? And that's where I want to focus. So I think you're right. You do sit somewhere in the middle. There's a lot of companies out there that say they're not software companies, so they don't want to homebrew their own code at all. And likewise, there are other companies that don't have the money to pay for the tool, so they need to homebrew because it's the only option they've got.
I think the potential risk of homebrewing your own, even if you are more than capable of doing it, and which I'm sure everyone has that capability.
Yeah.
Is you then end up with all of that IP often buried in a few people's heads or self-documented within the code behind the CI/CD and then the pipelines and so on. And then there's the risk of, well, do you know what, if that, you've got that key man risk, basically.
Exactly. Although open source code starting to make things a little bit easier, and tools like WhereScape Red and 3D, the more that the command line is developed, the less there is for the scripts or codes that need to do it. You just kind of almost point and shoot, and it does the rest.
And we're very much on a mission, and have been for quite a few years, to make everything, basically to be command line first on everything. Of course, there's a UI to do these things, but we've gone back through all of our UI components and made them available by the command line, and continue any new developments are generally command line first, and then we build a UI on top of it that calls the command line, so that you know that you can do it by the command line. And that means you've then got that, you can start working manually, even if every sort of manual click is doing what would have been 100 clicks if you were doing it genuinely manually without any kind of automation involved. But you work through it manually. Maybe if your flow was to discover a source, generate a history model for that, deploy that onto Redshift, generate all the code to populate it, run a test, and then deploy that onto the production environment. What was that? 5 steps, however many steps it was. For each of those, you would have a few clicks to do within WhereScape software, and you would be able to do it staggeringly fast. But you would have to know what those clicks were. So if you went through and did that, Simon, and then you were on some other project and someone else came along, they might slightly get the clicks wrong, or put the wrong configuration in, or make the wrong choices and do it out of sequence.
Yes.
And that's where we've opened up this concept of workflows within WhereScape, where you can actually say, I've got these 5 steps. Each of them has a little bit of configuration with them. Do them all by the command line, but hide them behind a button within the software. So when you click that button, it runs the 5 steps. So there's not really, I don't know, is that CI/CD? Perhaps, but it's being driven from within the software. Once you're then happy with that, and you say, do you know what, actually, we'll run that at 6 a.m. every Friday or Saturday, you can then take exactly those same steps, that same script, maybe it's a Python script or whatever you choose, and you run that from Jenkins or Azure DevOps or whatever it might be.
Yeah. And I think those workflows, I mean, I've had personal interaction with the team to, can we have this command line, please? Can we do that? Can we do that? So I know firsthand that it's very easy to put those requests in and they turn up, and it's great. But the workflow buttons themselves, for me, they're trigger points. They can either start the CI/CD process off from WhereScape, or they can be the entire workflow sat inside of WhereScape. It depends on what you want to do. But the added power, as you mentioned, is the fact that you can integrate WhereScape into Jenkins, Octopus Deploy, DevOps. Any CI/CD pipeline can interact with WhereScape, and you can then automate all these things. So we've had great fun recently. We've used things like Bamboo, which is an Atlassian kind of product that helps to do the CI/CD pipelines. We've integrated WhereScape 3D with Jira. So when the developer goes, that's my data model, I'll go ready to deploy, and it goes and creates an approval process. And then that approval process then kicks off your pipeline to deploy the model into Red. All of those things, because of the command line, it kind of opens up a whole door into automation, not just sort of CI/CD, but lots more. And that's one of my sort of features of WhereScape is that the command line, full stop, because you don't get that with any other tool, I don't think. But you know, the way you can tailor it, it comes down to you. How much you want to tailor it is how much you want to, you know, where you want to start and end. everyone's data development lifecycle is completely different, despite everyone going, no, it's the vanilla one. It's not, because there'll be something in there that you do differently to other people.
And where you want to weave your kind of your Git integrations into that flow, where you want to be storing some kind of record in different systems of what's been deployed, but also, so it really goes back to that what I mentioned much earlier on, which is define your manual steps and then automate them. Those manual steps have loads of automation in them. When it comes to WhereScape, you're basically automating the automation. You might also then, particularly if you're lifting it out of an application like WhereScape and controlling it all via something that has a broader enterprise remit, let's say, you can be doing broader things. So you might do that step-by-step process I described, where you're building out some new data capability and populating it. You might, at the end of that, then go off and tell some kind of BI reports to refresh, because you know that the data's then there. You might go off and run some downstream machine learning algorithms that populate some other system, and so on. So you've got that kind of whole bigger picture that and goes into the whole glossary as well. So I think that's really where we start seeing CI/CD being able to underpin, let's bring another term in, data fabric, where you've got different tools working together to deliver that kind of data marketplace. Yeah,
absolutely. And like you mentioned in their documentation as well, that's another feature within Red that you can automate within your CI/CD process, and then get that to just auto refresh, so that as the deployment goes through, the documentation's been updated. And if you've got all your peer review scripts and things just to make sure everyone's filled in the fields they need to do, then you're going to end up not only with the data product, but material for people to refer to when they try to understand what the data model does.
Yeah. I mean, your data product can then be a data asset, a table with some data in it, a curated small set of documentation that describes that object, has all the wordy descriptions, it has all the lineage showing that it came from all these different source systems, but it also has perhaps some test results in there and some profiling results saying this is what the data looks like at a high level. This field's unique. This one's got 15 different, this is the cardinality of it, 15 different values. Here's the top 10 values in this field. You can kind of really neatly just package that together as a deliverable. It's been tested, it's met these tests. The tests might be data tests saying around data quality. The tests might be to do with data volumes. So are they what were expected? Is the number of rows in that target data set the same as the source, or within an expected range? But also you've gone through and you've tested, and this tags back to what you were saying about big eval earlier, where you can have your kind of off-the-shelf test rules, and those test rules might be nothing to do with the data, but were all about the metadata. So did Dave, the developer here, did he follow the correct sequence for building out this data product? Did he have some kind of staging layer that deals with some kind of obfuscation of sensitive data that applies the different security and so on?
Excellent.
There's a lot there.
There is a lot there. Talking about the quantity of what's there, so what's your opinion about using CI/CD for sort of large and small projects? Do you think it's the sort of thing, if you have nothing, do you go and put it in for a large project or not a small project? Or do you do it for everything? Or
I think it has to be, can't remember the word, not measured, but proportionate. It needs to be sort of proportionately considered, or if you're doing some tiny piece of development work, you don't want to, like, why would you waste your time? And there are valid reasons to answers to that question. If you're doing a very small piece of work, the overhead of setting up some kind of CI/CD process, if you don't already have it, just might not make business sense. And I think with anything, you've got to have a business case for doing it, even if it's just a kind of 10 seconds in your head or on the back of a piece of paper. Does it actually justify the effort here for the size of this project? If it doesn't, then you could argue there's no point. You might argue there's always point for governance and compliance reasons. Depends on what the data is, depends on what industry you're in, depends on regulations and so on. And I think if you're working in a environment where you've already got established CI/CD practices and ways of working, and a new project is spinning up, why wouldn't you consider adopting some of those existing processes? Maybe they do need to be tweaked a little bit to fit your specific example, but always worth looking at for sure.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it is all about effort versus reward, right? So try and use it wherever you can because it speeds things up in the long run. But yeah, you wouldn't use it on a 1 week project, would you? Let's be honest.
No, quite. How come you guys didn't deliver the project for us? We ran out of time, but we've got this amazing process that means next time, and like for 1,000 times after that, we'll be able to do it really quickly. Brilliant.
Exactly.
Thanks.
Exactly.
I asked you to do one thing.
Let's talk about best practices. So we might have covered a lot of this already previously in what we've discussed, but what do you consider to be best practice when you're building out your CI/CD around your data lifecycle?
I'm not sure if we specifically called it out, but the concept of scripting end-to-end processes means that you've then got it documented. And I know having a script self-documenting is not as good as having a nice wordy description and some process flows and so on, but it's a damn sight better than not having anything at all and it being in someone's head. It's got to deployment time. What do I do again? I'll deploy that and then I'll check that, and do you know what? I'm going to skip that check today because I'm sure it'll be fine, and so on. You've really taken a, let's call it old school description, but like a run book of all the steps you're meant to take, and you've written them in actual code and the code doesn't lie. The code is telling you exactly what it's doing. And I think there's a huge value in that. You're basically documenting your process and assuming, which you should do, that's checked in to some kind of source control as well, then you can see how that evolves over time. And you can go back to previous versions and potentially figure out why processes weren't working so well back then and they're better now and so on. Can I just flip this around on you and say, what do you think the best practices are? Because you're the one. So I mean, I look at this from a WhereScape perspective. We see all sorts of different users of, ranging from the very large multinationals to one-man bands. And some are using CI/CD, some aren't, and there's no real sort of company size profile that dictates that. I certainly look at it from a software enabling perspective. I want to make sure that WhereScape has those hooks, has those command line controls, so that you can weave all of our functionality into any kind of CI/CD pipeline. But Simon, you're working with customers on the projects and a lot more down in the weeds, so it'd be good to get your take on it.
Okay, so it's a good one. So more often than not, it helps if I start from the deployment and work all the way back, because it kind of makes more sense, especially when you start talking about standards and tests and making sure that when you do a deployment, you've got a good way of rolling back and you've thought it through, because not everyone can do if you've got Snowflake, you can recover data like that, and it's a script, 3-4 lines of code, and you can bring back that whole table, and the
however
metadata
big it
sorts
is, right?
itself out. Yeah, exactly. No, regardless of the quantity of data, it's going to be quick. But if you're on a SQL server and you've dropped that 10 gig table, well, it's gone. So you need to make sure that if it's really important, how to protect it. So that is the safety point. So for me, best practice always goes around the safety points of the deployment. So can we easily recover from this position? And it starts with the deployment. Can we recover from a failed deployment? And then you go back and go, right, can we ensure that the deployment is fit for production? Can we do the tests, the balances? And it's not just the data testing, it's also things like peer review. Can you make sure that the fields are being filled out and described properly? Does the documentation look good? Has Simon left something in there that we don't really want to see? Is there some erroneous code that's going to delete a table that we haven't spotted? And then you go back into, right, once you've got it into a development environment and you've got lots of people collaborating, how do you make sure that you protect that collaboration so that people don't overwrite each other? Or if you do, how do you get that bit that's been overwritten back? So we often start with those key pain points and build the CI/CD around that. And then all the other good stuff gets built on top of it. So things like, everyone will want that. And then bigger companies or companies worried about governance will go, right, now I need approval processes. Now I need to have some sort of documentation, reports and stuff all built in over the top of it. But the CI/CD best practice for me is remove your pain points. Make sure you've got that covered and it's automated. Like my example earlier on of the last minute failure going into production and then you spend 3 hours rolling back. Do you really want your people spending their time doing that, or do you want them doing what they're good at? So, for me, CI/CD best practice is about, ensuring that you've got that covered and people get time back.
And I guess from more of a softer, less techie perspective, I would imagine I'm thinking of one particular customer where they've started really focusing in on CI/CD in their data analytics space, but they've already got a whole DevOps team. Okay, it's a small one, but they've got a team that's dedicated to DevOps on the infrastructure side of things, and so they've already got some kit in their bag that they can utilize, and they've already got some processes in place and some kind of approvals processes, which may or may not translate nicely into the perhaps sharper timescales to do with iterative delivery within analytics. But I guess there's an element of listening as well as telling and finding out what's already in place and making sure that your approach fits in and is conscious of that.
Yeah, absolutely. CI/CD, you can go down a fully automated route, or you can embed human beings. You put human beings in the way to review a report, to act as an approver. It's going to slow the whole thing up. But often, that's the only way you can detect unknown unknowns. Because CI/CD will control known issues every day of the week, but at the moment, and CI/CD won't help you with unknown unknowns. So you could create gates and, just to say, well, if that test comes back as a pass, then move on to the next bit. Of course you could, but there often are problems and review points that you should probably have someone just take a look at. But yeah, I'm kind of going off on my own sort of tangent and thought there.
So it sounds like...
I think, so.
Sounds like a bit like a warehousing project. It's never finished. It's always, or maybe not. Yes. It's not that it's never finished, but it's always got to be ready to evolve as you find out new unknowns
stuff
that need accommodating. Yeah, stuff's probably the best description to use there.
The next question is around what should we try and avoid doing? And I think we're kind of stumbling onto that from best practices. What shouldn't CI/CD do? I mean, it can't make tea, coffee, serve the drinks 2:00 on an afternoon.
It probably could actually, with a bit of home automation and smart switches.
Yeah.
What shouldn't it do? I'm not sure I've got an answer to what it shouldn't do. I guess maybe just approach-wise, rather than boiling the ocean and trying to just automate for the sake of automation, there's a pragmatist approach that says automate what makes sense to automate. And that's not just a CI/CD thing, that's just a general automation thing. If you're going to do something once, there's no point automating it. If you're going to do it 3+ times, then maybe.
I think you nailed it on the head then.
Sorry. I was going to say, what have you seen done that you think shouldn't be done in terms of CI/CD? Is there any kind of just no-nos in terms of, I don't know, mixing different technologies together that ends up as a recipe for disaster, or using multiple Git versions and No,
it's more what you said. You sort of stumbled onto it. Having one thing that would an automation that would only ever work once. This is kind of, there was a customer we're working with, a bit of a hybrid. It was a data warehouse and application development team. So everyone tried to do everything inside of an application framework. So I think deploying a website, HTML, is a very different game using CI/CD to deploying a data model from WhereScape 3D, right? Some of the approaches were the same, but actually what they were trying to do is sort of create lots of different pipelines to work in different scenarios, and it got overly complicated. And then when you look at how many pipelines you've got, you go, well, you've got 15 pipelines to take it from development to production under certain conditions, but you're only using 2 of them. So what do we do with the other 13? What should we do with them? And I think that's it's once you define your framework, once you've got everything, you start from your manual process, you've built something up, you've got something that kind of works. Don't create versions and versions of it, just kind of keep adapting what you have. The other thing is to make sure that if you've got any logic within your scripts or within your pipelines, it's very well documented what it's there to do. Don't just leave, script X, Python script XYZ is being fired off, and then another one, and then another one, and you've not put any comments to say, well, this is doing that test, this is doing that test. As you learn more, you might need to add more tests and balances. You might have different scenarios to encapsulate within your pipeline and handle. Just try not to over-engineer it. Keep it simple, keep it documented. I've seen what it looks like the other way. When it's in a different environment, it was a hybrid kind of data development team, application development team. So that's the reason for it being overly complicated, because there were lots of clever people.
Over-engineered.
Yeah, don't over-engineer it.
And so that's looking at kind of what not to do. What would you say the top three considerations were for, I want to get started and get involved in some CI/CD today? What would you suggest?
Yeah. First thing is identify your pain points. And it might be, it takes you the longest amount of time. It's the thing you do the most frequently, which can often be the longest amount of time, or it's the thing that takes the longest amount of time when it goes wrong, right? So like your rollback as an example. Yeah, the riskiest one. So identify those. From those, then figure out which one could you do the quickest. Don't figure out if it's the most important. Just see if you can do it, because you don't want to spend weeks and weeks and weeks figuring out a rollback procedure and then just to get to the end of it and it's really difficult. Try and pick the one that's easiest to do first, and then build around that, so that you know then you've got something on the planner and your to-do list, something you're going to try and build up over time. And then start off with, the last thing to do is just take that and just, rather than when you're doing your manual process, fire off that script and then use that a few times. So you're doing the whole manual process of deployment, for example, but you're using the script at that point in your deployment process, and just monitor it, check it, see how it goes. Once you get comfortable with it, that's when you can hand it over to a tool. And there's lots of tools out there, CI/CD tools. There's lots of Git repositories. There's lots of, deployment pipelines, things like Jenkins and Optimise Deploy, DevOps, GitHub. There's loads of different tools that you can deploy. You probably need to pick with the one that fits your environment first, because some people like using PowerShell, some people like using bat files or Python scripts or some form of C#, whatever it might be. You're going to know what works for you, but you're going to have the overhead of looking after that. And what can you really afford to run, and what can you really afford to maintain? Open source can be great, but it can give you bugs and add more time to your day. So that's why I always start in that kind of approach. Just those 3 steps will get you to a point where you've at least replaced part of the painful part of your deployment process or your day with something that's easy to achieve. And then you can build from there. And I think that often puts people in the case to say, look, you can go to your manager and go, look, I've just done this thing. It's replaced this little painful part, which has actually helped save time, money. It helps me be consistent in what I do. It's really helped. Let's talk about how we can do this at a bigger scale, how you can blow it out, and maybe turn it into a more consistent and stable platform to deploy or do whatever you want. That's how I would. Yeah, I think that's. I've probably gone off a little bit on a tangent, but
I think we've covered a huge amount there, haven't we?
No, I think that's really, really good. Thank you, Simon. I'm gonna.
You're welcome.
Right, so I'm going to hand back over to Chris now. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.